Hi, I'm Bridget Harper, and our group is going to present a case analysis on Intel for MBA 534. I'm going to begin our presentation discussing the microprocessor industry in 2005, and over the next several slides, I will apply the five forces model to this industry to demonstrate the profitability of the industry. This was a global industry, and in 2005, the main two competitors were Intel and AMD. Intel led the competition in the market, and AMD was a close second. The first force I'm going to discuss is the threat of rivalry. We applied four factors towards this force in order to determine the strength of the force. The first factor that was looked at was the number of competitors in the industry. As I discussed on the first slide, in 2005, the main two competitors in the microprocessor industry was Intel and AMD. The microprocessor also was not a standardized product. It was strong for its brand image. Companies and consumers alike would purchase their computers based on what type of microprocessor was inside. And Intel and AMD were well known for their fast processing. Also, it cost consumers quite a bit and companies to switch from one microprocessor to another. If a new microprocessor came into the industry, it would cost quite a bit for a consumer or a company to replace their technology in order to utilize this new microprocessor. And lastly, we looked at how hard it was to exit the market. One thing we looked at is it cost a lot in R&D in order to develop a microprocessor and enter the industry. You needed strong human assets in order to stay up with the latest technology, and it took a lot of capital assets in order to fund the R&D and the plans that were needed in order to create the microprocessors. The majority of costs were in design, development, marketing, and building the fabrication facility. So it's difficult to enter the market, and it's also difficult to exit the market due to the amount of capital you had tied up in the market. Based on the factors that were applied to the threat of rivalry, it was determined that this force is weak. The second force we looked at for the microprocessor industry in 2005 was the threat of new entry. Again, high capital requirements are needed in order to enter the industry due to the technology and the research and development that is needed in order to be competitive in the market. Also, as I discussed on the previous slide, if a new entrant came into the market, it might be hard to get a consumer or a business to buy the technology that their microprocessor is being used in due to the high cost of switching to new technology. Also, current entrants also have economies of scale. They already have contracts with buyers who buy in bulk and are buying those microprocessors based on brand image in order to better sell their products that are utilizing the microprocessor. And lastly, Intel, in the case study, was discussed how they used patents and intellectual property in order to block new entrants. And also they used cross-selling and partnership agreements in order to help control new entrants. So based on these factors, we looked at the force of threat of new entry and determined that this force is weak. For the force for the threat of substitutes, we looked at the industry of microprocessors in 2005 and determined that there was no viable substitute in the microprocessor industry in 2005 that would rival the market share for Intel and AMD. Intel was worried that AMD had the money and the technology to further cut into their market share. And Intel was also worried with the new technology that was coming out with smartphones and tablets if they would be able to compete in that industry. But as far as the microprocessor industry, there was really no substitute to rival AMD and Intel. Therefore, we determined that this force was weak. For the force for threat of buyers, we looked at 3 different factors to determine whether this force was strong, medium, or weak. The first force we looked at was the bargaining power of buyers. Bargaining power is strong when companies buy in bulk. If they're going to buy in bulk from another company, then they usually try to get a discount. So those manufacturers who are using the microprocessor in their products to resell in the open market then would put pressure on Intel to give them a better price since they're buying in bulk. Also, we have the factor of the economy. It discussed in the case study how in 2001 there had been an economic downturn and Intel was relieved that they had come through it still profitable and relatively unscathed. But it also discussed during economic downturns how companies and consumers do not invest in new technology, therefore putting pressure on the manufacturers of products that use the microprocessor, and then in turn puts pressure on Intel because the market is taking a downturn and they're not selling as many microprocessors because the products that use their microprocessors are not selling as well in the open market. And then lastly, we looked at how the cost of microprocessors affects the price manufacturers charge for their end product. So they're putting pressure on the microprocessor manufacturers to keep the price low, and also threatening that if they don't keep the price low or give them a discount, that they could switch to another microprocessor alternative. Therefore, based on these factors, we determined that this force was strong. The last of the 5 forces that we looked at was the threat of suppliers, and we applied 3 factors to this force in order to determine its impact in the industry. The first factor we looked at was the ease to change suppliers. Since in the case study it indicated there was 2 main components that went into a microprocessor, and those components were commodities, it was determined that it was relatively easy to change suppliers. We also looked at the impact of costs to the manufacturer of microprocessors to change suppliers. And again, since the case study indicated that the main 2 components that go into microprocessors are a commodity, we determined that there would be little to no cost to switch suppliers. Lastly, we looked at the factor of the easiness it would be for a supplier to forward integrate and get into the microprocessor business themselves. As we discussed, or I discussed in earlier slides, it's very high cost to get into the microprocessor industry. It takes a lot of research and development, it takes human capital, it takes assets, it takes a good manufacturing plant, and therefore it would not be likely that a supplier of the components such as silicon and transistors would forward integrate into making microprocessors. Therefore, based on these 3 factors and applying them to the threat of suppliers, we determined that the force is weak. In conclusion, on my discussion of the 5-force model to the microprocessor industry in 2005, I would like to go over the industry profitability assessment. Based on the threat of rivalry, we determined that that force was weak. Based on the threat of new entry, we determined that force was weak as well. On the threat of substitutes, that was a weak force. On the threat of buyers, we determined that that was a strong force. And on the threat of suppliers, we determined that that was a weak force. Based on these conclusions, we would determine that overall the industry profitability is high due to 4 of the 5 forces being weak. I would now like to turn our presentation over to Julian, who will discuss the capabilities and resources of Intel. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Julian Spiller, and today I'll be speaking about Intel's resources and capabilities that were used to help Intel gain a competitive advantage over its competition. I know Intel is known for a lot of different processors and partnerships, but today I'll be focusing on the microprocessors and how it helped Intel develop into a successful technology company that they are today. I will begin by speaking about the resources, which are the intangible and intangible resources on how Intel developed the competitive advantages. The first critical resource actually started in 1979, where Intel challenged its sales engineers to design and develop a microprocessor that would be attractive and not only attractive to customers, but also agreed upon and used by customers in order to win the competition on the campaign. It would prove to be successful come 1980 as IBM chose to partner with Intel as the foundation of their PCs, and it was important for Intel at the time because IBM was actually a juggernaut in the market for PCs in 1980. And by 1984, IBM actually ended up owning a third of the market share, and what also was crucial to IBM's partnership was IBM used a open architecture to develop their PCs, which allowed the competition to copy their design, which means more exposure for Intel and their microprocessors to be used in the other competitions throughout the market. And you would see by 1987, those that copied IBM's design and IBM along with them would go on to own 2/3 of the market in 1987, and by 1995 they own 90% of the market. So it helped Intel gain a competitive advantage through the market because they were getting the exposure and developing what's soon to come a brand for microprocessors and partnership with different PC companies. So moving on to the next critical resource was in 1986 when Intel became a sole provider to Compaq for their microprocessors and the new generation. Now, Compaq was a growing company, but it ended up again proving to be successful for Intel because Compaq would go on to pay $150 per microprocessor and helping Intel continue to build their revenue to use towards resources like research and development, marketing, and again, coming later on, their branding. And by 1994, Compaq actually would pass IBM as the market leader at 13.1%, and IBM fell to 8.6%. So Intel making a good decision to switch to being a sole provider for Compaq to continue to grow, and again to develop the resources needed to continue to dominate the market against the competition like Motorola and AMD. So the next critical resource would be the Intel Inside campaign in 1991. What this is just Intel finally launching their brand and getting support from their customers to utilize Intel's logo within their products to help again gain exposure for branding. And again, it's another successful decision by Intel as their sales would rise to 63% in 1992. And in the early 2000s, they actually became the 5th most valuable global brand with the estimated value of $35.5 billion and cementing their places within the technology market for a lot of different reasons, mainly created by microprocessors at this point in Intel's history. So moving on, I will now discuss the capabilities, which are how Intel sustains or increase the durability of the processes that's used to gain a competitive advantage. So here I have two different processes that you see here. One is a dynamic capability, which is the repetitive process, and the other one is an operational capability, which you see here is the copy exactly manufacturing process. And what the copy exactly process is, it allowed Intel to find one process that worked for them, and they would copy it throughout all their facilities to again establish an advantage to lower costs and increase the yields on their microprocessors. So the difference to the repetitive process is it helps deliver the processor to the market quicker than the competition because it's just natural to them. They know how to develop the next generation processors. They follow the same process. So it becomes easy for Intel to again get to the market quicker with their product for the customers, and it's proven to also work because in 1982, AMD was actually 2 generations behind because once they became a sole provider to Compaq Intel, AMD could no longer purchase the license from Intel to start to use it as a base microchip. So they would have to actually develop their own process and develop how they were going to make their own microchips, and again putting them 2 generations behind and giving the market an advantage to Intel. So now we're going to look at the VRIO analysis for Intel, and what this shows is it valuable or rare, the different resources and capability, and that's the how they sustain or get the competitive advantage, and is it immutable or can it be exploited by the organization to decide the duration or the strength of the competitive advantage for Intel. So here we see the resources crush campaign being a sole provider to Compaq in 1986, and the Insight campaign all being a sustained competitive advantage, simply because they're valuable. With the Crush campaign, it proved to be valuable because they were able to use their cell engineers to get the partnership with what was then the strongest PC provider in IBM. Was it rare? Yes, because no other company was doing it at that time. Was it immutable? Also, yes. Mainly being because it can't be. It was used by knowledge that can't be either taught or learned, or a different dependency or path dependence as a barrier, as you see here, which means there are certain steps that Intel takes to gain this competitive advantage using the Crush campaign that other companies couldn't copy. And then was it exploited by the organization? It was. The customer relationship was built with IBM, and again, they were starting off once that was built with IBM to dominate the market and to sustain competitive advantage. The next one is sole provider to Compaq in 1986. Was it a competitive advantage? Absolutely, because it was valuable. It was rare because they were only the provider for Compaq's PCs. Again, it was immutable, and they exploited by being innovative, again building customer relations, and gaining in financial gain by the cost of the microchips and how dominant Compaq was in the market, meaning Intel also was dominant in their market because they were utilizing their chips as a foundation for their PCs. And you see again a sustained competitive advantage. The Insight campaign also was valuable because it launched their brand, and it was rare because it's a brand that's well known. It's hard to recreate Intel's brand. Is it immutable? Absolutely, for many reasons. And then again, it was exploited by organization, by customer relationships, building it with different PCs, especially in today's world. And then again, using their brand to gain to strengthen the financial positions. So finally moving on to the VRIO analysis of capabilities. Well, here you see it's not as much sustained competitive advantage because there are processes that at that time was providing competitive advantage, but they easily can be copied or just different varieties of processes, even though one part of the step in the process could be different. It was easy for competitions to copy what Intel was doing and leading to a less competitive advantage as companies were copying Intel and their processes. Now, the copy exactly process was a competitive advantage because nobody at the time was doing what they were doing to continue to quickly push out numbers and lower the cost of their products. So it did give Intel a competitive advantage. Now, is it admittable? No, it's not. Was it exploited by the organization? No. But it did enough to where it gave them a competitive advantage by saving costs and increasing the yields on the microprocessors that were created and shipped out to customers. So that's a little bit about the competitive advantage using the resources and capabilities and the VRIO analysis. How it can help Intel in the future is just to continue to develop the relationships and providing the resources needed and using their team, their engineers, their brands, just to continue to develop products that's gonna again allow them to continue to dominate the market. So now I will pass it over to Evan, who will speak a little about the weaknesses and strengths of Intel.
My name is Evan Stutz, and for my part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the weaknesses of Intel and some of the strengths that ARM has and how that contributes to both of their business models. So starting off with Intel, some of the activities that could be considered some weaknesses for them. So first off, we have the microchip performance, and really with Intel, it is their hyper performance in their microchips, and along with that comes a high cost. And then we also have the battery life with Intel. With the high performance, you have a low battery life, and what this contributes to is a lacking of an untethered experience, which in this case in the smartphone industry, users want to have an untethered experience where they can, use their phone for an hour or two and not have to plug it in and charge it. And with Intel, with these high performance microchips, basically they got more performance than what they need, and this is contributing to a low battery life and not giving the consumer what they want. So these would be considered some of the activities that contribute to the weaknesses of Intel. On the other hand, for ARM, some of the activities that contribute to some of their strengths also include microchip performance and battery life. But in the case of ARM, they have a lower performance microchip than Intel does. And as a result, this is a lower costing microchip. And one way they could do this is by, instead of using a metal jacketing around the microchip, they use a plastic jacketing. And this keeps costs down. And with a lower performing microchip, they have a better battery life. And this contributes to a good untethered experience for consumers. Obviously, a lower performing microchip is going to have better battery life, and especially with a smartphone that's not running complicated apps, you don't need a high performing microchip. And with this, great battery life, and that's basically what consumers want. So that is one of their strengths as far as ARM. So looking at Intel again, in analyzing some of their weaknesses, we also look at some resources and capabilities that are lacking. And as we talked about earlier, obviously with the high microchip cost, early on they were losing out contracts to big companies to lower priced units because they were building microchips that were more for personal computer units and not smartphones. And also we have their approach to business. So Intel is a vertically integrated company, and what this means is all aspects of production, marketing are included in their business model. So yes, they have a good handle on the whole business model, but also there's a lot of extra costs that are associated with this approach to business. On the other hand, with ARM, they have a lot of resources and capabilities that are contributing to some of their strengths. So again, as we talked about earlier, they have a lower microchip cost, and this allowed them to gain contracts with major manufacturers in the 1990s. This included companies like Apple and Nokia and Texas Instruments, and also their approach to business. Unlike Intel, they are focused only on design. So they basically design these microchips and then license them out to other companies to market and produce and put in their smartphones. And with doing this, they can avoid a lot of the major production and marketing expenses like Intel has to incur. And lastly, for ARM, some barriers to imitation that they have that allowed them to gain a leg up on Intel were, number one, path dependence. So with them focusing on design and their path to their business model, they were avoiding major production and marketing costs. And with that path, they were able to get a big leg up on Intel. With going that path early on in their business career. And then also with the first mover advantage, they were one of the companies that were able to start manufacturing these inexpensive chips early on, way before Intel even started thinking about it. And this gained them many lucrative contracts, obviously with Apple and Nokia, Texas Instruments, and I think by 2013, they had a 98% share in the smartphone industry. And again, with this first mover advantage, they were able to get in the market early, get these good contracts, and really get a big market share over Intel. So I'm going to hand it over to Justin now.
My name's Justin Nasser. I'll be going through the diversification of the case. And when looking at it, for the most part, the largest portion of this can be seen when Intel did purchase McAfee for their pre-existing software and different structure that they already had. This can mostly be seen to add value in a couple different ways. The first one would be the possibility to penetrate emerging markets. So when looking back at the case, these emerging markets can, for the most part, be seen the mobile markets and the different softwares. They already have the brand reputation in place. So McAfee at this point was a well-established company. They already had different products and different product lines of that software. And so this should help Intel and McAfee. With already being a well-established brand and company, they do bring in the research and design and some experience in this market to be able to hit the ground running and do well from there. Also, with it does come the research and the data already in place. So from here, they have a baseline and at least some understanding of the market, some of the demands, trends, and customer preferences before completely moving into this market. This should help in terms of trying to have the research, figure out, and understand their customer base. Another part comes with it helps broaden the customer base overall for Intel. Currently, Intel at this time did have um, their customers who continually bought from them and were loyal to them. But with this, they're able to move into new markets and try and go after new consumers to increase that. The next one and the final one does come with the increase to the customer lifetime value. This is a little bit different than the one I just discussed, just because it does look at going after the loyal customer that they already have and being able to entice them and get them to purchase their new software products from McAfee. And overall, the more product they're purchasing from Intel and McAfee, the higher that customer lifetime value will be for them. So when looking at the acquisition of McAfee from or by Intel, the first part can be looked at how they're going to create that value and how that creation is going to be made. So the first part where they should start at is leveraging the shared knowledge of the organizations. And that should help create value during this merger and throughout this purchase. This is important just because ideas and processes are needed to be understood and implemented correctly in order for this to move smoothly and well. With that being said, a system does need to be set up and be put in place just so that information can be interpreted correctly, data can be shared, ideas and understandings can also be presented and understood clearly in order to continue with this merger the best way possible. The final part is the core competencies. It should be at the center and the focus even before the merger started, just because they need to be looking at what they do well, what could be possible competitive advantages for them, and how to move forward from there. And again, these two need to be communicated properly and well with the other company, just so everybody knows what page they're on and how to proceed from there. So the acquisition of McAfee, the final portion of that is looking at the integration strategy. From reviewing the case and some supporting details, it can be seen that the conclusion was made to keep McAfee as a standalone company for the time being. It does seem to be the best decision overall for the time being. This seemed to be best because McAfee, before they were bought, did act as their own standalone company and had a recognizable brand image and customer base. McAfee acting as a standalone company should be able to bring this over to Intel and gives Intel the ability to show joint partnerships and try and increase brand equity overall for both companies. Since Intel
The first recommendation we would make is for Intel to be more cost effective. ARM and AMD have been able to compete in this market because they're able to improve and utilize a lot of Intel's technology at a lower cost. And Intel has lost out on market share and many contracts with some of their companies they do business with because of that. They do have the Intel Atom processor, and we think that that would be the key to improving their market share in the low price segment. To do this, we would have to increase advertising and maintenance of this processor. And we think that due to Intel's size, ARM would have trouble competing in the low-end segment as well because they would not have the same economies of scale. So therefore, they couldn't produce as much, and Intel would be able to capitalize on that. The second recommendation we would make is diversification through product bundling and specialization. They pretty much have a key market focus on the market as a whole. They don't really have any niche kind of segmentation that a lot of the competitors have started doing. So they're kind of late to entry on some of the niche or mobile kind of markets. So they would do this by, instead of the vertical standard integration that they usually do, they would do horizontal integration by acquiring other companies or forming strategic partnerships. They've actually done that successfully with the McAfee integration, and we think through kind of focusing on maybe the more mobile markets, and then maybe like video processing and some of the other ones, they'll be able to use the expertise of some of these other companies to kind of infiltrate into those markets as well, instead of the broad market as a whole. And they also have reliance on Microsoft, and we see that not a lot of these chip manufacturers have a lot of dependence on a certain provider. So we think through entering some of these niche markets through horizontal integration, that they'll be able to kind of consume some of that extra market share that ARM has started to kind of eat up. In conclusion, Intel has a sustained competitive advantage in a lot of areas. It's endured the test of time, but we do see some kind of potential threats entering the market. They have high microchip costs, and they have a vertically integrated business, and that's leaving new opportunities open to ARM and some of these other competitors. ARM, they have first mover advantage, meaning that they're getting their processors out to market in these different niche areas faster than Intel is. And through increased efforts and kind of a lower design cost, we think that Intel would benefit from producing some of these mobile chips and cheaper, more efficient chips than what they have been doing, but not necessarily straying away from their original business plan. So ultimately, reduce the risk of market share, and through horizontal integration and development of new market segments. So to continue being the market dominator in the chip processor industry, we think that right now they're doing fine, but we can see from these new threats that they'll start to need to kind of branch off of their core business into some of the mobile and other segments in order to maintain their dominance. And those would be our recommendations and kind of a wrap up of this. Thank you.